Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is another one of our annual Jean Monnet Roundtable discussions. We try to organize it each year, and each year we try to invite external guests to have a discussion about European security. And each year we are um, in a little bit of a different place with the question of European security. There are different issues coming up, different challenges. And this year we are very lucky to have Mrs. Gesine Weber, who is a PhD candidate at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. And she's writing her dissertation on flexible forms of cooperation in European security and defense. And we also have Professor Richard Whitman, who is Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. And he is also a leading expert on European security. This roundtable is part of the activities organized within the European Union Jean Monnet Action grant. So EU support has to be acknowledged here. What I would like to do is something kind of very simple. I will begin with a few remarks and perhaps a few questions for us, and then I will invite our guests to perhaps share some initial observations about where we are in terms of European security environment today. We have students who have joined us this morning. Most of them are my own students on my optional module, European Power and the Geopolitics of Europe and Asia. And I will invite our students to ask questions. You can write them down in the chat, or you can raise your hand and that way participate in the discussion. So I guess first thing I wanted to do is pose a few questions for us, and perhaps that's something we can reflect on as we go on. And I guess the biggest one is, what is the most significant threat to European security today? We ask this question every year, and perhaps since 2022, it is a little easier to answer than it was before, or at least the answer seems to be more straightforward. But is it? Is it the war in Ukraine? Is it the biggest or most significant threat to European security today? Is the West adopting the right strategy to the war? We are more than 2 years into the war, and we don't see an end in sight. Right? We constantly argue for Ukraine to receive more support, and for the European Union to be more unified, more strategic, more geopolitical. Is it the right strategy? Is this a way to stop the war? Is it really our objective to stop the war, or is it our, when I say our, I mean the kind of Western objective, for Ukraine to win and for Russia to lose? Because those can be two different things. Has the European Union been able to consolidate as a security actor? Should we expect the EU to play a role as a security actor? And if so, what kind of security actor? What instruments does the EU have or should have to be or to perform as a security actor in this case? I guess one other question that is important and at this point is Europe taking the prospect of Donald Trump in the White House again seriously enough? Will it matter to Europe and European security? Finally, what to make of the French turn towards a more hawkish rhetoric? Is it Macron just being Macron, doing his thing, or is it something more meaningful? And to conclude, or before I conclude my kind of initial intervention, I watched recently a video recording of a meeting with Hungarian Prime Minister at the Chatham House. And one of the questions was, of course, about European Union sanctions against Russia and the Hungarian, let's just call it, distinct approach to Russia and this war in Ukraine. And perhaps to play a little bit of a devil's advocate, I will recall his answer and the points that he made in response to that question. And he said, there is a degree of hypocrisy in the West and in the European Union, at least when it comes to sanctions and how they are implemented. And he gave 3 examples to illustrate his point. He said, Russia is currently building a nuclear power plant in Hungary. Hungary kind of asked Russia to help with that project, and Russia is delivering it in Hungary. Hungary wants to boost a share of nuclear energy on its energy market. And for that, Hungary might be criticized. But what he said was that the subcontractors for working for the Russian company are American, German, and French companies. Those companies work for the Russian company and they are paid by Russia. The second example is, he says Hungary has been under pressure not to buy nuclear fuel from the Russians. But he says the #1 supplier of uranium to the United States last year was Russia. Washington spent over $1 billion on Russian uranium in 2023. And finally, he talked about oil. He said Western European countries are making a big deal of how they are weaning themselves off of Russian oil, how they become more energy independent or less dependent on Russia. But he says the share of Russian oil in India was 1% before the war. Now it is close to 40%. And coincidentally, before the war, Europe was not buying Indian oil, and now Europe is the #1 customer of Indian oil, which he says, of course, is a Russian oil. And we see those kinds of similar kinds of analysis quite often, how all of a sudden Russian exports of different products to Central Asian countries suddenly grew since 2022, and the European imports from those countries also suddenly grew since 2022. So the question is, what are we really doing here? What is going on? Are we happy with kind of delivering weapons and implementing or kind of announcing sanctions, organizing sanctions, but then when it comes to implementation and the follow-up and monitoring how those sanctions are in fact implemented, we pretend we don't see things, or we just collectively agree not to talk about them? Those are some of the questions that have been kind of on my mind. But what I want to do is invite you to share your thoughts on the things that you think are important, and perhaps we can return to some of those questions later. Gesine, would you like to share a few thoughts
Sure, I
from
can.
your side?
Happy to kick us off. I have not more than 12 minutes, right?
Sorry?
Not more than 12 minutes, right?
Sure, 10-15 minutes.
Always an easy challenge to pack all that in so little time, but let's give it a try. So I'm going to pick up the very first question that you started with, Camille, which is the biggest threat for European security in 2024. And I think it's important not necessarily to single out a single one threat. I mean, of course, when we're looking at questions like European borders and really the security of European citizens, I think we could technically say that it's Russia's war against Ukraine. But I think when we're looking at that a bit more from a meta perspective, that the biggest threat for European security in 2024 is really the simultaneous management of different crises that are all interlinked. So basically, getting the simultaneously of different conflicts right. On the one hand, in terms of dividing political attention, on the other hand, also in terms of dividing resources, be it capabilities, be it financial resources, while we also have EU elections coming in and the big elephant in the room of the US elections. So it's basically this getting the big picture right and closely linked to that, getting the strategic autonomy piece right. We've been talking about strategic autonomy, I think particularly since Macron brought it up in the 2017 Sorbonne speech, but the concept itself isn't new. Already found in Council conclusions of the EU in 2012. So basically, when I talk about strategic autonomy, I'm referring to the idea, maybe to make sure that we're all on the same page, that it is not about equidistance between the US and China, that it is not about becoming a third bloc in US-China competition, but that it means to develop a European strategy that is explicitly based on European interest and European interests, think both in singular and plural, and that it is to implement that strategy wherever it's possible, of course, with partners, but if it's necessary, also alone. Why is it so important to get to this point in 2024, and why is, I think, 2024 a critical juncture for that? Because I think that we have several points that render it absolutely or that have shown how important it is for Europeans to basically get their act together and be able to respond to security crisis also alone. We see that, for example, with the war in Ukraine. Or I would say that a lot basically really depends on this transatlantic component and the willingness of the US to protect Europe and also to really defend Europe. We've seen that with Russia's war against Ukraine, where it took literally not ages, but many months to get through another support package in Congress. And that basically showed how important that the entire defense of Ukraine relies so much on the US, and that Europeans are either unable or unwilling to step up, be it for financial reasons, be it for political reasons, that without this US support to Ukraine, European security cannot be guaranteed. And this idea that Europeans still in 2024 make their security dependent on a country that might elect Donald Trump into the White House in less than 6 months is maybe not the most reassuring perspective for European security. And that's why I would argue that the biggest challenge is really getting to a point where Europeans are able to act by themselves and equip themselves also with capabilities. When we look at the priorities and all that, it's of course not only about Ukraine, but also, for example, about Gaza. At one point, we are also going to talk more about the Sahel and terrorism, maybe from some anecdotal experience as someone who's normally based in Paris. You see that now with the Olympic Games, that terrorism is really a major concern of European countries, which tended to neglect the southern flank a bit over the last 2 years or so with the war in Ukraine. And here again, there's no way that there's no way for the United States to step in and take care of the fight against terrorism for Europeans. So that also is something where Europeans have to step up on the one hand, of course, or I mean, that is one of these areas where you have the intersection between internal and external security. But it's certainly one of the points where Europeans need to do more, and also need to do more alone, because nobody is going to do that for them. And this realization has to come. Same is true with crisis management. Here we see it, for example, also in Gaza with the new Operation Aspides in the Gulf. But we see that this was like, it took so long to get to the point where it was launched, and displayed the European lack of unity so masterfully that the EU has significantly lost credibility, not only in the region, but only beyond. And a challenge both for this crisis and future crisis will really be to work on the European unity behind that as a security actor, and speaking with one voice and not with 27 plus one, to make sure that threats or like situations are at least publicly assessed in a similar way and then responded to. Next point is, of course, China and the Indo-Pacific. And here again, the question is it a security threat? I wouldn't say that it's a security threat in the sense that, like Russia, for example, I would say that we have no evidence that China is going to attack any European country soon, or is planning to do so. So it is a totally different situation with China than with Russia. But China, of course, with its economic statecraft and all that, and the leverage it has on European countries, simply constitutes a massive economic and geo-economic, and hence also geopolitical challenge for Europeans. We've seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic. We see that it's very easy for a country with China's economic power to, which also produces so many critical components for European technology and so on, that the European prosperity model depends a lot on that. And in general, economic security is something I think that we've been talking about massively in the last 2 or 3 years, but it's really time for Europeans to see economic security as a part of the security of European citizens. And here again, really leverage the instruments that it has, because trade is an exclusive EU competence. And there is much more that the EU could basically do to step up as an actor here. Yeah, in a nutshell, this is basically I would say the few points of parallel theaters that we have that directly impact Europeans. And then, of course, we have US-China competition as one other big factor that is hanging over the head of Europeans, where both the US and China are asking Europeans to choose. The idea that Europeans haven't chosen yet is actually, I would say, a wrong one, because Europeans are part of a transatlantic alliance. But that doesn't mean that Europeans are blindly following the US and simply adopting US strategy. And here again, particularly also with the trajectory of an election of Donald Trump, critical for Europeans this year to start reflecting now on what that means for their posture in the Indo-Pacific. I'll wrap up with a few priorities that, again, are a bit more the overarching priorities and not necessarily singling out single threats or regions. So what do Europeans have to do to basically address this multitude of challenges that they are facing? I would say the first thing is, of course, short-term emergency planning, because we've seen all the time and all the time again that emergency preparedness is certainly something that Europeans are not good at and have to become much better at, be it because the situation in Ukraine is worsening, be it because we have a crisis in the Middle East. This idea that Europeans can effectively and very quickly address a crisis in the neighborhood, we are not there yet. So really leveraging the tools, for example, that we have in the strategic compass with the rapid deployment capacity, which is a force to be of up to 5,000 troops to be quickly deployed. And for example, ensuring entry or exit. These are things where Europeans really need to step up. So really this capability to react quickly and effectively. Then second thing, very simple, put the money where the mouth is. This comes to, or this is basically the overarching theme, I think, for European security, because it is still being underfunded. We see that countries are stepping up their budgets, which is certainly a good thing to do. But we also see that it's not sufficient yet, and that maybe a system like joint borrowing through the EU, as done for vaccines and as done for energy, would maybe be a good step to really make sure that Europeans are able to address the threats they are facing in an effective way. Then I would say, and that is quite closely linked also to getting as the EU relations to the UK right, really think European security. I wouldn't say independent from the US, because you cannot do that, but think European security also as security ensured by Europeans first, and enhance coordination among Europeans, and an EU plus UK plus Norway plus other NATO allies format, because the EU just has massive financial firepower if it uses that correctly. And then make sure that this is a good European pillar in NATO, because it is, on the one hand, the biggest pull factor to basically have or hold the US engaged in Europe, but also a good way to prepare potential abandonment by a Trump administration. So I would say it's really this idea of getting Europe right. Then, as I mentioned above, it's also about the Indo-Pacific and China, and I think Richard is going to potentially touch a bit more on that. But it's really this idea of finally speak with one voice and get the China piece right, in all the in the things that the EU is doing, which finally needs an EU-China strategy, because the strategic outlook is not enough. And here again, coordination with the UK, absolutely critical. I think we might see a window of opportunity there if a Labour government is elected. Then another thing, the list of priorities is getting longer and longer, is really this question of Russian influence worldwide. Because we've seen that in the Sahel, for example, when the French pulled out, not at least also because of Russian influence, wasn't the only factor, of course, but it was one of the factors with the arrival of Wagner, which is closely linked to Russia and all that. And really seeing foreign policy outside Europe also through the lens of countering Russia. And last but not least, when it comes again to the security of European citizens, it's a question of resilience and tackling hybrid threats, which is even more important in an election year in the EU, in the UK. And that is also something that I think Europeans need to coordinate among themselves much better. And I also see a massive window of opportunity here to do that really as Europeans, as EU plus UK, Norway, and so on. I wrap that up. I think the baseline here is European strategic autonomy is not something that's at some point came out of Paris and is an end in itself, but it's really, I would say, the means to an end to address the multitude of different security challenges.
Thank you, Gesine. Richard.
Well, morning, Carol, and very early morning, Gesine. Thanks very much for the chance to think about and talk about things on European security. Gesine and I had a sort of a sort of prior email exchange where we sort of primed ourselves a little bit as to the way that we might approach things, and I think my view was that I'm probably more glass half empty, and Gesine is more glass fuller, I would say. And let me explain why I have a slightly different take, I think. And I'll do that by talking first of all about what I call the European geopolitical disorder, and then something about the influence as actors on European security that I see in play. So first of all, the European geopolitical disorder. What do I mean by this? It's really much broader than just the war in Ukraine. It is primarily the fact that we have completely lost what was the Helsinki European security architecture, which is a set of institutions, arrangements, understandings and roles that governed European security really from the 1970s through the end of the Cold War and to today. And imperfect as that arrangement was, it created some quite important ordering principles for Europe, and they were primarily concerned with how do you maintain order between European states, how you uphold a set of norms, and absolutely crucially, how you control arms and the offensive, defensive posture of European states in terms of how they arrange their armed forces. All of that has now gone, and obviously it's gone predominantly because of Russia's actions, not just in the war in Ukraine, but Russia started very early on with its early invasion of Georgia, and then obviously the actions in Ukraine from 2014 onwards, basically to dismantle this order and to have a policy in effect of trying to dismantle the architecture and the arrangements that we had in place, because Russia saw that disorder more to its advantage than to its disadvantage. And European states, primarily through inaction, lack of political will, lack of resources, preoccupation with other issues, basically didn't invest as much in their collective security, meaning more than just spending on defense, than otherwise might have been the case. And obviously much more recently, we've had the first state-on-state conflict in Europe since 1945, and that's where we're stuck. And it's quite difficult to see how we're going to see ourselves outside of that arrangement in the very foreseeable future. And I think the new divide in Europe is essentially between those states that realize that Ukraine is absolutely the fulcrum for European security, is going to be the state over which the tussles over the European security order happen. It is for both Russia and I think for Europeans in different ways the measure of their success, if you like, in their view of European security order or disorder being managed and demonstrated. And so Ukraine has sort of moved from what really it was in a position on the periphery of European security and its sort of diplomatic order to being, a central preoccupation. And as I say, for me, the kind of divide in Europe is essentially between those who realize that's happened and that's the case, and those who haven't or are unwilling to come to terms with that. And the other thing that the conflict has done, and I'll come on to say something about this in a little while later, is that China has inserted itself in European security in a way that's way beyond the geopolitical insertion. It's taken a side and it has a stake in the way that the war in Ukraine turns out, and that is not to be underestimated. If you were to draw a parallel with the Cold War that we spoke about, a sort of Asian. We used to talk about the Asian theatre or the Indochina theatre of the Cold War and the European theatre. Those are conjoined now, and they've been conjoined by China rather than by Europeans. And that is a major order change for European security, and again something we haven't quite come to terms with, I would suggest. But if you accept my proposition, that Ukraine is the thing, if you like, then it is also going to be a central preoccupation for the international relations of Europe, meaning preoccupation for the key institutions, but also particularly for the North, Central, and Eastern European states. And that's where we see, if you like, the most energy has gone into thinking about Europe, EU Europe, and individual European states' roles and responsibilities within European security. But it also means that the tussles over the enlargement of the EU and NATO to Ukraine are going to be a central political preoccupation. In declaratory terms, the commitment has been made to Ukraine being a member of the EU. In practical terms, that's going to be a huge political tussle. For NATO, the politics there are a bit more complicated, but I think the direction of travel is pretty clear at the moment that it's going to happen. The question is probably when, but they are both sort of decade-long projects, I would suggest. By way of background as well, we have one of the things that Europe used to make Europe stand out in comparison to other regions was not just its high degree of institutionalization, it's the nature of its politics, which was very norm governed, but also its arms control regime. We had very strict and very well organized and broadly accepted arms control arrangements in Europe, both conventional and nuclear. Those have all disappeared. And that makes Europe a very dangerous place to be. And as we've seen with Russia's willingness to sort of nuclear saber rattle, it demonstrates, and I think we're seeing that the sort of nuclear weapons question is back into European security and defense discussions that many people have thought had been consigned to a kind of exotic and embarrassing area of thinking about security, and for a very small number of specialists. So, we really face a very, very complicated environment, and we face an environment which is just entirely different from the context at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was a great deal of optimism about the sort of shape of Europe's security and Europe's capacity to be meaningful, primarily through the vehicle of the European Union. So what things do I think are sort of worth throwing into discussion, perhaps to provoke a little bit in terms of this as the background? I mean, for me, it's clear when we think about Europe's security order that we've had, on the one hand, the US role in Europe recapitalized, it's reinvigorated or reaccepted in a way because of the way that the US has supported Ukraine. But at a moment in which the US role as a sort of leader of the West is questioned as it's never been questioned before. We often talk about Europe's geopolitics having been outsourced to the United States during the Cold War. To a large degree, we outsourced, meaning Europeans collectively, outsourced the geoliberal leadership to the United States, which was in large part a values leadership, and we don't have the same faith in the US providing that leadership anymore. And that means that there is a broken element at the heart of that arrangement. And the US's security guarantees for Europe are only one manifestation of that relationship, but it's in trouble in some key and important respects. Second point, and this is to reiterate the point I made earlier, but also perhaps to pick up on Gesine's point about China. I mean, I think that the European security order is completely inseparable from the Indo-Pacific security order now. So partly because the way that China has behaved geopolitically, this is not by accident or by the method of market, it is by a considered set of actions on the part of China to do so. And to occupy a place in Europe's geoeconomics, the Europeans will find very, very difficult to shake off, and that compromises Europeans' freedom of action and freedom of maneuver. in Europe, but also outside of Europe, I would suggest. And we got a slight taste for that during the COVID pandemic, but it was only a very slight taste. I think this is probably a controversial thing to say, is that actually the EU has been dislocated from the center of Western policy making as a consequence of the war on Ukraine. It's actually been the G7 and the Quad that brings together the US, UK, France, and Germany, and NATO, which have been far more important for defining policy towards the conduct of the war in Ukraine diplomatically, defining the broad approach towards sanctions, and the EU has been an imperfect subcontractor of a broader policy which is being made elsewhere, I would suggest. And you know, I think that's one of the reasons why we have to be really careful why we use the label or word European in all of this, because in many instances EU Europe is used as a proxy for talking about Europe. They are entirely different things in terms of the geopolitical dynamic, and entirely different things when one thinks about the responses of states towards the war in Ukraine, I would suggest. But you know, that may be something that we can debate. And I think, you know, to perhaps be even more cheeky, I think the EU role on the war in Ukraine is going to be very imperfectly building a defense industrial side that may help Ukraine at the margins, but almost everything that the EU has dabbled in when it comes, the EU as opposed to member states have dabbled in to support Ukraine on the military side has ended up being a work of imperfection. If you think about acquiring shells, for example, that's probably the most the best example of that, I would suggest. But I'm not also that optimistic about NATO. So, you know, the answer isn't the EU. The answer isn't automatically NATO, because NATO itself is obviously has decided that it's going to play a particular role when it comes to supporting Ukraine, which is not to do so directly, but to sort of backfill in a way on European security by sort of strengthening security for the NATO neighbours that border Russia and Ukraine. And that's because NATO is caught in the headlights of the US electoral cycle. And it's obviously found it difficult to be decisive when it comes to the question of Ukraine's membership. And that, I think, is primarily because there is a real anxiety on the part of all NATO members that NATO's credibility can only really be seriously challenged once. So if NATO was a sort of direct participant in the war in Ukraine, if it loses its credibility, then it can't be regained. And obviously, that's something that it wants to preserve in terms of you know, making Russia pay attention, frankly. Two more substantive points, if I may, and I'll shut up. I think that Europe has rendered itself pretty irrelevant to the wider Middle East and the Sahel, and I include Gaza in that. I think it is an area in which Europeans are just in no way, shape or form in a position in which they're able to shape or direct what's happening in either of those regions beyond doing so at the very margin. Where am I a bit more optimistic, if you like, about, you know, where I think things look slightly more rosy? One is that you know, the center of the European political dynamic on security now is the Baltic Nordic region. You know, that Poland, the Balts, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and those states that work closely with those states in the region have the most acute sense of the order of the security threat that Europe faces. That's why we saw the enlargement of NATO to Finland and Sweden. It's why we've seen the Baltic states and Poland play such an important role, both in trying to diplomatically animate the EU, but also the levels of support that they're given, measured against to Ukraine, measured against their GDP. In contrast, I'm very pessimistic about, rather skeptical, not pessimistic, about the Macron turn on European security. Skeptical because I will be a believer once you see a resource shift, both in terms of military equipment sent directly to Ukraine, but also France stopping some other things like buying Russian LNG gas, for example. I think there is Macron has engaged in quite a lot of performative diplomacy, and I think this is just the latest episode of that. I'm also quite pessimistic about Germany, not because the Zeitenwende wasn't a dramatic moment for Germany, but it's the follow-on, and in particular the follow-on commitment to make or to put Germany's defense budget and its share of GDP spent on defense as being a permanent and ongoing commitment. But I'm also pessimistic about the UK because it has the will, but it has the wealth. And in a way, the tragedy for the UK is that it has a huge stake in Ukraine, or has taken a large stake in Ukraine's place in Europe. And on the EU, it has a stake in the EU enlarging to Ukraine, but it has no say. And on NATO enlargement, it has a stake and a say, but I don't think it has a vote, a swing vote, if you like, that gets Ukraine into NATO anytime soon. So I've not thought to sort of put a downer on proceedings or to be deliberately provocative. But I think it is a very complicated and underappreciated moment of complexity for European security, and our politics and the allocation of our resources haven't moved in a direction that suggests that the acuteness of the challenges is actually has actually landed yet.
Thank you, Richard. Before I shift the discussion and allow students to ask questions, and we already have some questions, just one kind of question or comment from me to you both, if I may. Gesine, you opened your comment with the observation that the war in Ukraine perhaps is not a single greatest threat to European security, but a multitude of crises that the EU faces is the biggest problem for the EU. But the question is, hasn't it always been the case? Because if we read the first European security strategy from 2003, right, there is this kind of section where it talks about threats and challenges, and there is a list, and there has always been a list of threats and challenges. The problem today, or the difference today, in my view, is that one isn't like the other, that one stands out to the extent that renders the other perhaps not irrelevant, but much less significant. And that's the kind of revival of the interstate, old-fashioned, traditional kind of geopolitical kind of war, territorial war on the European continent. So I guess the question is it still the multitude of crises that is the biggest problem for Europe today, or is it that one is clearly not like the other? And to you, Richard, a comment or a question. You mentioned something interesting, that European countries we can divide today according to those which understand that Ukraine is the thing and those who don't appreciate this fact. And one person who clearly understood that Ukraine was the thing was Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was a former American national security advisor, and in 1997, he published a book, Grand Chessboard. And in that book, he says, Ukraine, a new and important space on the Eurasian chessboard, is a geopolitical pivot because its very existence as an independent country helps to transform Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. However, if Moscow regains control over Ukraine, with its 52 million people and major resources, as well as access to the Black Sea, Russia automatically, again, regains the wherewithal to become a powerful imperial state spanning Europe and Asia. Now, this quote is being kind of thrown around recently because it seems very relevant. But what I think is extra interesting, if I may, is that one person likes quoting Brzezinski quite a lot in particular, and is very fond of engaging with those arguments, and that's Alexander Dugin. I watched his recent lecture where he was referring to that quote, and his argument was that Russia gets it. And this is not an ideological war, it's a geopolitical war, and it's the very war that Brzezinski was afraid would happen, and Russia doesn't, and Russia understands the importance of Ukraine. So the question is, how do we engage with that? I mean, if Russia has this, if the sovereign existence of Ukraine is such a big problem for Russia becoming a superpower, and if regaining the superpower status is the ambition for Russia, and Russia understands the significance of Ukraine in that equation, what do we do with that? So I invite you to respond if you have any. Gesine.
Sure, happy to do it. I think, yes, of course, like the EU has always had to manage a multitude of challenges, both internal and also like externally. When we think, for example, about, let's say, early 2010s or so, 2014, we also had Russia attacking Ukraine. We had at the same time the Arab Spring. So Europe has always been, I would say, in the last years, a place where you had to juggle several security challenges. But when as you were referring to the 2003 European security strategy, I was thinking about how the narrative has shifted from then to now, because this security strategy, I'm not sure whether it starts with this sentence, but I'm pretty sure it's among the first sentences where it says Europe has never been so prosperous and so free. And I think this is a question that we couldn't apply anymore today. On the one hand, because the war in Ukraine is really a war on the European continent, and because it's different from many of the other challenges that Europe has seen in terms of security threats before. Like, on the one hand, of course, we have simply the scope of this war. Also, when you compare, let's say, this war to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, it's totally different in terms of the territorial threat that is there. It's totally different in terms of the conventional threat. It's totally different in terms of the nuclear threat. And all these, I would say, are so existential challenges that we cannot compare that to crises that have been there before. And then at the same time, we also have basically, I would say, in the last or since the end of the Cold War, Europe has not really been the chessboard of geopolitics. It has maybe had some conflicts in its periphery, at least when we think about, let's say, the EU plus UK. But in general, Europe was a safe place to be. And now Europe is becoming, again, to some extent, a playground of geopolitical power games. As Richard said, like, China is also kind of inserting itself into European security. Then we have the US, which is siding with Europeans. And then at the same time, Europeans also have to think about how they address this geopolitical setup in other theaters outside Europe. That I would say that the baseline hypothesis, or the baseline has changed. We are now in an era where Europe has to think geopolitics, and before it would have been good to see the world through a geopolitical and realist prism, of course, but Europeans could get along without doing that. They could get along with doing crisis management in its neighborhood, which was certainly insufficiently done when you think about, let's say, Libya or other crises in the Middle East, or also the Sahel. We could certainly address all the shortcomings of what Europeans have done there, but muddling through was something that worked surprisingly well, I would say. And with the current threat environment, muddling through is not an option anymore.
Thank you. Richard, would you have anything to add to that? Or?
Well, thanks very much for the question, and maybe if I may, in answering you, I can answer Libertas's question in the chat, because this idea of geoliberal Europe has just been sort of explored at length by a guy called Richard Youngs, who has a book just out. I don't know whether you can get it into the library, Carmel, in down in Southampton. But it's Geoliberal Europe and the Test of War, I think it's called. And I mean, it's essentially an argument that Europeans. I think this broader argument is around a lot now, but it's been quite nicely summarized to say that Europeans have to combine the values with the geopolitics, and how they're going to make that work, and that really is a sort of measure for success. It's not easy. It's not going to be easy, but in a way, that's the sort of litmus test as to whether Europe is going to be a sort of meaningful proposition with all of the challenges that it faces. So, I'd take a look at that book, Libertas and others, if you sort of fancy seeing that argument rehearsed at length. I mean, I think Brzezinski, had many interesting things to say, and he's close to the top of my list in terms of US geopolitical prophets, I would say, and certainly his readout of Europe is far better than Kissinger's. But that's an argument for another time. And I think Dugan as well. I mean, is absolutely spot on, frankly, in terms of where we're at. But what's interesting is it's not Europeans, who sort of got to that place first, and that's it's because of something that I think Gesine alluded to, which is that Europeans, or some Europeans, sort of outsourced their geopolitics elsewhere. And when we needed to sort of bring it back in-house again, once we didn't have to outsource it at the end of the Cold War, we found that a really difficult thing to do, because we didn't think that we were on a chessboard anymore. To borrow from this chessboard metaphor. But of course, Russia and China didn't see things in the same way. And one of the problems that we've had is that we've often projected our beliefs about what's possible and how the trajectory that other societies or political systems might take, in a way that satisfies our own desire to reinforce that we've got the model right. But we are absolutely now, the sort of cockpit or testing ground for forms of authoritarian, both in a political sense, both in the way that it is used to direct the use of force, but also in geoeconomics. China's view on how it might organize the geopolitical economy and how it might insert itself in the relationship between Europe and the US. These are not things that have happened by accident. And the Chinese leadership is now much more willing to say stuff about how it wants to split Europeans. And we've obviously seen an example of that with Mr. Xi's recent visit to Europe, that Brussels is not the place where he even feels the need to pass through. And either he visited his his most useful propositions, I think, in terms of those who would act as effective agents for China, read Serbia, or states where I think that he still has some hope that they can cause complications for Europeans in having a coherent geopolitical view and an appropriate view on China. Read France. That, again, that may be controversial, and you could probably gather I'm not a great fan of Macron. But you know, for me, you know, the greatest possibility is the prospect of the recognition of division of labour on the part of European organisations and European states. And clearly, you know, the EU's capacity to do all sorts of things when it comes to geoeconomics, and particularly when it comes to transborder issues, you know, climate and migration and so on. I mean, that's, you know, that's what the institutional architecture is going to be more effective for. But I think it would be sensible all round if the focus on building up a European capacity for collective defence is thought about solely in terms of NATO. That's not to say, you know, NATO as it currently exists, but for Europeans to build up sufficient political credibility in terms of the contributions they make to NATO, and to play an active role in redesigning NATO so it's a much more modular organisation, that the US doesn't have that hardwired role into every aspect of Europe. And for that reason, I think that a European security and defence policy that thinks in different terms from that is a delusion, frankly, and it's a delusion that we can't afford as Europeans. We could have afforded it 10 years ago, you know, when Russia and China weren't in the position that they were, but we simply cannot afford it today. And that allows me to sort of get to Mohammed's question about, does the EU currently have a grand strategy? Well, no, if you think in those terms, based on what I've suggested, but possibly yes, in the sense that it's always had a grand strategy, which is it wants to make the world more like Europe. It wants to have a rule-governed international order. It wants others to be as prosperous as Europeans. It believes that peace comes through trade, and that effective processes of managing collective problems like climate change is best done through institutionalization. And that is a very respectable grand strategy to have. The problem is, it doesn't set you up very well for others who have quite different grand strategies and essentially want to pull apart the order that you think is a valuable and important one to have, which is what Russia and China want to do, which is why they are so closely aligned. You know, they're not closely aligned because, you know, Xi Jinping and Putin happen to like each other. They're closely aligned because they share the same view, which is they want to see a systemic change when it comes to the arrangements for the processes of international relations to be managed and the way that they're manifest in the institutional arrangements which are in place. And we suffer, I think, from the US, you know, having lost its self-belief that those arrangements that it built are the best arrangements for the West, broadly understood. And I think that's the difficult moment for us, and in a way, that's the challenge for EUpeans to insert themselves and to respond to that. But that also requires a certain amount of self-denial on the part of EUpeans when it comes to where you think about the best place to do security and defence. Sorry, that was a sermon rather than an answer to your question. I apologise.
Thank you, Richard. I know you mentioned that you had to leave earlier, so you know I don't want to keep you. You're welcome to stay, or you know.
About 20 past, I have to go.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, that's perfect. Gesine, I wanted to get back to you with that question about grand strategy, because I know for your own research you work on the flexible forms of security cooperation in Europe. Does that question of grand strategy come up in your research? Because when I think about grand strategy, I I think about inflexibility. I think about this idea that we should have one vision and we should have one way to kind of implement it. And yet in your kind of research, you look into kind of flexibility and how that can perhaps work in the European Union context. So does that question come up in your, or does that issue come up in your research?
Yes, it does. Although I'm more looking at the question of whether the flexibility or basically loose coordination outside the EU and NATO is also to some extent a response to geopolitical challenges and to systemic factors, as you would put it in realist theory. And I would say maybe one of the reasons why we are seeing so many formats outside the EU and NATO, or so many add-ons to the existing security organizations, be it, for example, the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, although that was formally launched under NATO. I mean, it's NATO allies, but pretty much doing its own thing, if you want to put it like that. Same with, for example, now the European Sky Shield Initiative. Then we see things like the European Intervention Initiative that was created to basically create a strategic culture and work on scenario anticipation. So nothing intervention here. There's a devil in this name. But I think one of the reasons why these formats pop up is basically that the existing organizations do insufficiently address the security challenges. And as Richard said, I would say, like, no, there is no grand strategy of the EU. They, at least in the field of security and defense, the strategic compass that was adopted in 2022 is certainly an incredibly important starting point. But I would rather see it as a white paper for security and defense, and that's also how the EU calls it, rather than a grand strategy, because a grand strategy, I think, really describes an actor's place in the world, where this actor wants to be, and it links means to ends and also long-term goals. And what the strategic compass does is that it brings together a lot of instruments, a lot of new instruments, how to respond to challenges. But it's less about how the EU sees itself in the world than how it reacts to the world, if that makes sense. And these flexible formats outside the EU and NATO basically really address the shortcomings that were not addressed in the institutions. When we think, for example, about the European Intervention Initiative, you can think about that thing what you want. It's arguably not the most significant thing in European security, to put it politely. It's a bit like a military workshop of high-level Ministry of Defense officials coming together and doing scenario anticipation and bouncing ideas. But why are they doing that? Because it's a bit of an informal format which allows them to socialize, to potentially bring their strategic cultures closer together. And why? Because we don't have a European strategic culture, arguably. Same, for example, with what we see with in the Red Sea. No, it's in the Gulf with the Operation Agenor, the European maritime or European-led maritime awareness mission in the Strait of Hormuz, where we have Europeans or a few European countries, 6, I think, teaming up after Trump left the Iran nuclear deal. Why is it happening? Also because the EU initially didn't do a lot there. So this flexibility, I would say it's more like a fill-in mechanism than the result of grand strategy. And maybe if I may also touch on the second part of Mohammed's question, whether the EU can ensure the pursuit of its strategic autonomy rather than undermining alliances. The thing is, I think, in my opinion, that's really a misconception, because the thing is that we are now at a place where almost all EU member states are also NATO member states. And when these EU member states, to put it like in very simple terms, know where they want to do, where they want to go, and what they want to do, and work on their capabilities, and make sure that this is compatible with NATO, then that I would argue is basically the opposite of undermining an alliance, because a strong partner is the best partner that you can get.
Thank you for that, Gesine. There is a question for us here from Lawrence. Will Ukraine join the EU before there is peace on the battlefield? I would say we can extend that question also to NATO potentially. Is peace a pre-requirement for membership? Would the EU or NATO make an exception for Ukraine? What would a member state at war mean for the EU or NATO? There has certainly been a lot of discussion in recent months about the potential membership of Ukraine in the European Union. Ukraine is a candidate state, recognized as a candidate state with NATO. Perhaps I would say, I'm tempted to say it's a little bit more complicated, but that would suggest that EU membership is not complicated. Both are extremely complicated. But is there a scope for I think it's a good question. Is there a scope for Ukraine to join either of those organizations before its borders are permanently fixed? And if not, then, again, what are we talking about here? Because the borders won't be permanently fixed in the foreseeable future. Richard?
Thanks, Carmen, and thank you, Lawrence. That's a really great question, because it's not a question that many European policymakers are willing to ask and to answer publicly. And perhaps an allied question that we need to ask is what happens if Russia wins? And we can debate what we mean by win, but for me, just for this argument's sake, it means that Ukraine loses agency. It doesn't get to make choices of its own. I mean, we could talk about what winning and losing on the battlefield means and so on, but I mean, for me, at the heart of the war really is that question as to choice on the part of Ukraine to decide whether memberships of those organizations are what it wants, and it's made that choice, as far as I can see, or certainly its electorate, if you like, and its political leadership have made that choice. And so the question really is for Europe's governments and for the US as to how we respond to that. And the response so far has been, in principle, yes, to be a member of the EU, and even stronger than in principle. I mean, I think you have to give the EU a lot of credit for the way that it has sort of accepted the political responsibility it has to offer membership to Ukraine. NATO is more complicated, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But frankly, we have to say that if we want those things to happen, then Ukraine has to win. And we have to want Ukraine to win, which means that we have to have Ukraine in a position in which it can defend itself today, and it can defend itself tomorrow, and it can have a sustainable defense for itself into the future. Because I think, unless there is some significant change on the part of Russia and China, that this is going to be the ever-present challenge. It's going to be the challenge of your generation, to address, in the same way that my childhood and a big chunk of my adulthood was conditioned by the Cold War and the choice that Western Europeans made in the Cold War. And obviously we know during the Cold War that there was a willingness to take a divided Germany into a military alliance, as well as a political and security commitment was made to Germany until reunification took place. And we also know, of course, that for the EU, taking in the divided Cyprus has been something that has been accepted as a proposition and has taken place. So there's, but I think Ukraine is a different order case, because as I say, the sort of, the Russia perspective on Ukraine, and the fact that Ukraine really is that is the territory in the country over which we will see a determination of what kind of European security order we have. It is so important to see that happen. I mean, if Ukrainians change their mind at any point and decide that EU membership or NATO membership is not for them, then that's a different proposition. But I think, the approach towards the war is predicated on the idea now that Ukraine can make that choice, and there would be a fair hearing and a willingness to facilitate that choice. So I think the way that you phrase it, Lawrence, is a great one. What is the peace that's acceptable to sort of advance those processes, because we're unlikely to see peace in the sense in which we might understand peace like end of the Second World War peace, that one country is defeated, that we're not negotiating the terms of an armistice and where people should place their forces at the end of that conflict. We are talking about a state, Russia, that will continue to have an interest and to want to stop Ukraine from exercising the choice or choices that it wants to make. So in a way, it's for us, meaning the West, or West, Central and Eastern Europeans, to decide at the moment at which we want to make those memberships happen. And that's going to require quite a lot of political courage, because there's obviously risk inherent in that choice. And it may or may not mean that Ukraine enters both those organizations when the conflict is not in a place that we would wish it to be. And it's difficult to imagine when that would otherwise be the case. The worst of all possible worlds, I would suggest, is that we sort of continue to hold out the rhetoric that these enlargements are possible, but no meaningful steps are made to make that possible. For the EU, that's to repeat the mistakes of the Western Balkans, where the EU, still holds out the prospect of enlargement, but for some states that seems to be becoming an even more complicated proposition. But for NATO, I think NATO has generally handled its enlargement processes better, but we were very careful with the end of the Cold War that we had the joint enlargement processes where there was choreography between the enlargement of both organizations. And I think how we do the choreography now is even more important, because if you like, we were caught out once when the EU sought to expand or to tie Ukraine closer to Europe, and that the Maidan process, and after that protests, and after that, and clearly we can't allow those two things to go out of step, as was the case before. So how you do that, I am not clever enough to suggest, but I also worry that we don't have sort of political leadership in Europe which is clever enough and, as I say, courageous enough to do the things that they would feel deeply uncomfortable with, but take a chance in doing so, because they see that's probably the best route to giving Ukraine a better future.
You mentioned, Richard, that NATO perhaps has been a little bit better at enlargement, but also you mentioned that the worst thing would be for those organizations to maintain the narrative of enlargement, but not having courage to take concrete steps to have it happen. But of course, one argument around the root causes of this war is the 2008 Bucharest Memorandum, right, where Ukraine and Georgia, in fact, were promised NATO membership, where everyone knew this would not kind of happen, right? So that was the narrative part, and the policy part never followed up. But from the Moscow's perspective, of course, all red lines were crossed at that point, right? Gesine, I want to go back to this question of flexibility. Do you think there could be enough flexibility in the European Union in particular to to create some kind of bespoke scenario for Ukraine to join the European Union. Do you see that happening? Do you see that being discussed in your research?
I wouldn't say that, like, I think it's a great question, and I would closely link that to what Richard said before. I don't think it's a question of flexibility. I think it's more a question of political will and courage. Because I think in the EU, we've seen that policymakers can become very creative and also launch instruments very quickly if they have to. I think if you'd asked people before 2020 whether you see the EU jointly procure vaccines and borrow money to do that, people would probably have told you that this is not going to happen in your wildest pro-European dreams, and that the same might apply to energy, and now we are there. So a lot of, in general, European integration has happened through creativity, but also simply through the pressure to act. So I think the pressure to act is there. Creativity might be there as well. The question is whether you have the political will to do it. And particularly when we're discussing this question, is Ukraine joining NATO first or the EU first, and all that? I think a critical point is also that, or an argument that I often or sometimes hear in the US is, why don't you take it in the EU? Because you don't have this military and solidarity clause. But I think the one big thing that Europeans really need to wrap their head around is Article 42.7, which is somehow also a mutual solidarity clause, was used once by France after the attacks on the Bataclan. But the thing is that, of course, the EU is not a military alliance as NATO is, but it has the solidarity clause. And that means that, of course, Europeans will not be neutral, but also that any kind of Ukraine integration in Europe might have massive implications in case Russia crosses other lines. And it's here, I think, where creativity needs to come in, where one could, for example, think about something like, let's say, staged membership, when you start with the economic side, which will be incredibly important for reconstruction, rule of law, but exclude, for example, Article 42.7 for the time where there is a war going on in the country. And I would say that requires probably, call it creativity, call it flexibility, but most importantly, the political will and leaders who are going to propose these steps and take these steps, because this is certainly nothing you are going to win elections with.
Thank you, Gesine. Richard?
Thank you. This will be my last intervention. I have to disappear, so I'm very sorry, because this is a great discussion. I mean, for me, the more I've sort of digested this question from Lawrence and the way you put it, Carmel, is that it boils down to whether Europeans, EUpeans, I think, are willing to fight and win a war for enlargement. It's not the way they've had to approach enlargement of the EU in the past, but that's probably the way that I'd sort of encapsulate the challenge in a way, because it's difficult to foresee. That for me is the real precondition of Ukraine's enlargement. We could dress it up in terms of whether it can meet the criteria for membership and so on, which other states have to do. But I just wonder whether inside the Brussels Beltway and within other European capitals, whether governments have asked themselves that question, and because in a way Ukraine sort of needs a satisfactory answer, otherwise it should make other choices, because at the moment obviously it's making a choice to fight a war because it believes that a particular future is possible for Ukraine. So thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Richard, so much.
Thank
you so much, Richard. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye, Gesine.
Bye, good seeing you, Richard.
Bye.
Thank you. There is another question here, and it's about the attempted assassination against the Slovak Prime Minister. It was quite unexpected, was it? I mean, but can we think it will have any kind of medium to longer term implications? Slovakia is not a big country. What do you think, Gesine?
Well, I have to admit I'm not an expert on Slovakian politics.
Neither am I.
From everything I've read about it, is that polarization was already a major issue in the society here. I'm not sure. Like at the moment, we know so little about what has basically happened that I would really refrain from thinking about geopolitical implications of that. First, because I mean, on the one hand, let's be frank, Slovakia is not the number one country that has the most leverage in the EU and the most significant impact on shaping where European security is going to go, but also because we simply don't know what has happened. Like, we simply don't know why and by whom he was shot, as far as I am informed, at least. So that making inferences for the geopolitical level would just not be a serious thing. What I think is much more concerning in this context than the geopolitical level is more the question of political culture in Europe, and the question of the political environment, because we're seeing not only that a politician is shot in Slovakia, we also see that politicians ahead of the EU elections in all across Europe are being intimidated, are being threatened. And this degree of polarization in European societies, I think, is something that is, of course, easy for Russia to exploit. And we have seen that it has done that in the past. So instead of thinking about the geopolitical implications of this one event, I would rather see the underlying trend of polarization and what that means for the resilience of European societies more broadly.
Thank you. No, that I would agree with that. One comment I wanted to make was about EU enlargement, because that's the kind of argument that I've been making with when talking about it with my students and you know on other occasions. Is in the past the enlargement was like always looked a little bit similar. There was this big political decision to enlarge, and then it was followed by this kind of long bureaucratic technical process of monitoring candidate countries, fulfillment of acquis communautaire, and eventually those countries would join the European Economic Community or the EU. But now with Ukraine, the process seems to be political throughout, and the dynamic has shifted. I would say it's not primarily in the interest of Ukraine to join the European Union, but it might be equally in the interest of the European Union to have Ukraine join as a member, because in the long term it may be cheaper. Weapon deliveries are expensive. All that equipment is expensive. If Ukraine, dealing with imperial Russia is expensive. If Ukraine can be preserved as a sovereign, independent country that is a member of the European Union, that it could prove to be cost effective in the long term, well, medium to long term, but also in order to achieve that outcome, something that kind of Richard alluded to, the EU would have to keep it as a kind of political process and make political decisions, not just technical decisions along the way. It's not enough in this case to go to Kiev and read the reports on how Kiev implemented this or that directive, but instead the kind of political decisions have to be made with long-term implications. And the question is the EU ready for that? Does the EU recognize that other things are at stake. But also the question is, how will other candidate states see and interpret that, right? I mean, we see in particular Serbia and Georgia, which seem to be moving in the opposite direction at the moment, away from the European Union. But I guess the main argument here is that the process of enlargement has become so much more political than it was in the past, and there is this technical aspect of it, of course, but it's different. It feels different. It feels more geopolitical today.
Yeah, I fully agree. In general, enlargement has always been a geopolitical tool. So, or in the sense that, for example, when you look even in the early years of the EU, enlarging was basically about securing peace in Europe and kind of making sure that Europeans sign up for similar structures and are all in the same structure, so they have less an incentive to attack each other or compete with each other. And then it was, of course, about the benefits from cooperation at one point. But this was really kind of this intra-European dimension. And now the geopolitical aspect of enlargement has shifted to this outside signaling dimension, if I may call it like that. So if enlargement happens now to the Western Balkans, to Ukraine, to Georgia, to Moldova, this is not because Europeans are concerned that Ukraine might attack a European country. This is for precisely the reason that the geopolitics of Europe has changed, that Russia is testing or has basically destroyed the Helsinki order that we've had, and that enlargement can help Europe to tackle this. So yes, enlargement is more of a geopolitical tool in the sense of foreign policy than it has been before. It is much more politicized. Because let's be frank, like there was from the technical process that we had on enlargement all the time before, there was a reason why Ukraine wasn't a member state, or also wasn't a candidate country, but was in the Eastern Partnership before the start of the war. And that was simply that Europeans didn't see a necessity to enlarge on the one hand, but also that it didn't fulfill the conditions to be a member state. And now the reasoning, I would say, so previously the reasoning was dominantly technical, with also the political lack of willingness for enlargement. And of course, it's very easy when you make that process so technical to hide behind that. So you don't have to say, we don't have the political will to work on that. You can simply say, yeah, but listen, you don't fulfill the chapters of the acquis, and you're not there with the conditions yet. So as long as you don't make these efforts, we don't have to enlarge. And I think this was demonstrated very well also with Turkey, where Turkey was always given, since the association agreements and the candidacy status and all that, Turkey was always given kind of the sticks, but and the carrots, but it was always kept in a waiting room, and it also turned to countries basically turning away. But I would say the enlargement now, of course, it's very different. And I fully agree with this idea that having Ukraine in the EU and also in NATO is potentially cheaper from a political and military point of view than having it out. But I think that European politicians have also very clearly signaled that it is not only going to be Ukraine that joins the EU, because they are very well aware that when you're creating, they don't want to call it a fast track, but in fact it would be a fast track to membership for Ukraine. And you have countries, particularly in the Western Balkans, that have made significant efforts in the last years to match each condition, and you keep them in the waiting room. Then this is also basically a space for more Russian influence in Europe. And this idea of enlargement, particularly to the Western Balkans or Georgia, can also be a tool to limit Russia's leverage in these countries, because because of what in IR theory would be called binding, because you're bringing them closer to the European project.
Absolutely, absolutely. One more question here is about the Arctic. Should the EU focus more on the Arctic? And I think this is a kind of wider. So if we kind of zoom out as we kind of come closer to finishing this discussion, as we kind of zoom out, outside of the war in Ukraine, you started your discussion, Gesine, with this observation that there is a multitude of crises, and the war in Ukraine is one of them. If we zoom out and want to take a broader picture in terms of where the EU is in 2024, in terms of its kind of geopolitical, strategic security environment, there is the Arctic, of course. But if it wasn't for the war in Ukraine, what other significant crisis or security challenges would you identify that the EU has to face, because they will impact or are already impacting the European Union? And if we look at the kind of security strategies from 2003 and 2008, and you are right, the one from 2003 does begin with this observation that Europe has never been so free or so prosperous or secure. But there's also things like terrorism, non-proliferation. In 2008, there is also climate change as a security problem. Those issues have not disappeared, have they? Right? How to reconcile kind of tackling all those different issues when we have this unprecedented geopolitical challenge in the eastern parts of Europe, I guess, is a big question that I'm sure you have a good answer for.
Well, let's see whether I have a good answer. But I think as you say, the challenge is to basically keep up with all the other simultaneous challenges while also addressing Russia's war on Ukraine. So I think here again, as it's really about resources, it's about money, and it's about on the long term making sure that Europeans can deal with these challenges because they have military capability. But it's not only military, it's also about resilience, it's about human resources, it's about having foresight and potentially also better anticipating crisis, because Europeans have often masterfully turned away or turned a blind eye on potential security crisis in its neighborhood. And then once the crisis really intensified, woke up and realized that there might be something to do there. And that's something that Europeans cannot afford any longer. When it comes to the Arctic, I wouldn't see that necessarily only as a geographic region, but more as a contested space in general. And hence link that also, for example, to a question of maritime security, which can be contested spaces, but also to cyberspace and also space like outer space, because these are also dimensions that are going to become more and more important with two underlying factors that we see, which is on the one hand technological transformation, making space, for example, when we talk about satellites and GPS signals and so on, extremely important, because the question is how you can secure that, how you can prevent an arms race also in space. Like there are so many questions that need to be addressed there, and the same is true with the Arctic, because the relevance of that region is going to change significantly with climate change, because of resources, because of simply also from a really geopolitical point of view, for potentially stationing forces and so on. So I would say it's more part of, in general, think more about contested spaces than only think about that in terms of geography. And to come back to that question of crisis and threats, I would say like one threat certainly is hybrid threats. So the question of disinformation, the question of also like cyber attacks and attacks on critical infrastructure. These are things where Europeans need to do much better. And to take up a point that Richard used, when it not only EU Europeans, but also Europeans in general, I think, need to make sure that they have the same approach and that they are going in the same direction of travel. And besides that, yeah, the threats like, for example, terrorism or climate change have not gone away. And again, to witness these challenges or to basically to mitigate these challenges, it's about money, because climate change is going to be much more costly for us if we don't massively invest now in a green transformation than we're doing that now. I mean, I could also touch on the military aspects of climate change, but this might probably become a bit too nerdy, so I'll keep that out here. But it's the one factor that is going to change everything. It's going to change how battlefields work. That's going to change how I would say also many societies can function. It's a catalyst for many crises, because it will force people out of certain regions. It has the potential to intensify resource conflicts and all that. And these are things that need to be taken into consideration, particularly when it comes to crisis management.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gesine. Well, I did enjoy this discussion a lot. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to the students for the questions. I think what we managed to do is we, of course, didn't manage to give final answers to all the problems that we have, but we did raise some important questions, and I think we made some progress towards kind of making the answers a little bit clearer, or kind of identifying the things that have to be further looked into. Thank you so much again, Gesine, for participating. It's been great having you here.
Thank you for having me. That was an interesting discussion. A lot of takeaways for me.
Thank you so much.